Hello and welcome to Health Innovators. I'm your host, Jonah Comstock, Editor-in-Chief at PharmaForum, and I'm joined today by Jennifer Schranz, Global Head of Rare Diseases in R&D at Ipsen. We're going to be talking a little bit about rare disease generally, some of the challenges in rare disease R&D, including some of the regulatory challenges and some of the other um, research and development challenges. And we'll be talking in particular somewhat about some of the spaces that Ipsen's working in. So welcome to the show, Jennifer.
Thank you, Jonah. Thank you for having me.
So tell me a little bit about yourself and about Ipsen's rare disease business and the work you do.
Great. No, thank you. Yes. So as you mentioned, I'm in research and development. I've been in the pharmaceutical industry for about 26 years. I started my training as an infectious disease physician working in AIDS. And I've really been drawn to rare diseases specifically because of the huge unmet need, the challenges, the innovation, as well as the ability to work really closely with um, patient organizations, regulators, as well as scientists and clinicians to try to, benefit patients by bringing important, solutions to the rare disease community because there's such a high unmet medical need.
So what are some of the kind of unique challenges that you face in rare?
Yeah, and I think that's really an important point, and it's even becoming even more challenging, unfortunately. And I think one of the issues we have in research and development is the fact that majority of diseases, like 95% of the rare diseases, and there's about 7,000, and so about 300 million people are affected by rare diseases, but the majority of them don't have any treatments, and so there may be little understood about the disease itself, the natural history, what causes the disease, if it's a genetic mutation, for example. So that's one set. And often in rare diseases, we see misdiagnosis and delayed diagnosis. So the very narrow window of time where you can affect the outcome for a patient may be limited. And so that's another concern. And from a research and development clinical operational standpoint, some of the difficulties are since there are so few patients, especially in ultra rare diseases, is that they are geographically dispersed. There's a lot of variability in patients. The study sites may have little experience in clinical research, so that provides some challenges. And then often from a regulatory perspective, because these diseases are not well understood, there may not be a regulatory pathway. So you really are, as they say, riding the plane while you're building it to try to understand what's important to patients and to make sure what your endpoints are also going to be accepted by the regulators.
Right. So there was a case in point fairly recently with one of the rare diseases, this FOP disease, fibrodysplasia ossificans progressiva.
That's excellent. So fibrodysplasia ossificans progressiva. So it's an ultra rare bone disease. Yes.
And this is you've been working on getting a treatment for this through the FDA, but there have been some hiccups and some complications. So maybe we can use that sort of as an
Sure.
example of some of the difficulties that you see here.
That's a great idea. So FOP, we call it short because it's hard to say the whole word. It is a ultra rare disease. So about 1.36 patients per million are afflicted as a gain of function mutation. And it's really a disabling, really relentless progressive disease where normal bone forms in soft tissues and the muscles and tendons. So what we know for patients who get diagnosed when they're young, when they're children, is that they progressively get bone that forms around their joints, around their rib cage, and that locks their joints. So if you can imagine being stuck with your arm like this or your hip, and then not being able to breathe long term, leads to pulmonary problems, etc. So it's very disabling. And if you can think about with this ultra rare disease, there are about 900 patients in the world that have this disease. So when you think about such few patients, and then when you really now we know what the genetic mutation is, but then you have to understand in development, well, how do you understand what you're going to show that your drug may be efficacious or not? So you need to do a natural history study. So a natural history study was conducted to really understand the journey of a patient, how they get diagnosed, what are their symptoms, what is relevant to them, and how to manage their disease. And then can your drug, your intervention, make a difference? And so a lot of work was done over the last 10 years understanding the disease progression, understanding how to develop an endpoint that both regulators will accept as well as are meaningful for patients, but also importantly are also going to be important to the reimbursement and the payers, which is really critical. So it's that kind of that combination of patients are center of what we do, it's critical, but what's important to them has to also be able to be shown from a regulatory perspective to get approval. And then you have to make sure that that value for that patient is also recognized by the payers and the reimbursement for access to the drug. So some of the challenges have just been not knowing the disease, so doing a natural history study, then working with the agencies to really validate what your endpoint is. So how are you showing efficacy? And then third is that do you decide on the plan of doing a placebo-controlled study, or do you do a natural history study? And if you think about so few patients with this disease, and if they're in the natural history study, you want to give those patients the opportunity to also participate in the study that may potentially have a benefit. So these are some of the discussions, and certainly leads to a very tortuous road with many, sometimes detours. But I think what's important, and you'll see this in the rare disease community overall, is that there's a lot of passion and resilience and a lot of innovative thinking of how to get to that end goal, which really is getting these drugs to patients.
So, are there things that organizations like the FDA do to kind of recognize that, hey, this is a different situation because there are so few patients? Are there pathways that allow you to have sort of a smaller study, or what's the kind of balance and the push and pull there, or do you think there's more that could be done on that side?
Yeah, I think the regulatory agencies really want to bring medicines to people, and obviously they're most interested in obviously having an efficacious and a safe drug. I do think there's more work that can be done. I think the FDA has also started a program where they're providing grants to do natural history studies for rare and ultra rare diseases, so that's really critical. But I also think there has to be what I call regulatory flexibility, balancing a small number of patients in the world that have a disease, and perhaps a placebo-controlled trial is not in the best interest of that patient when there may be access to a potentially active treatment. I do believe there needs to be a playbook or some ways of innovative designs to look at how do you get data on a natural history that can be used by multiple companies to help develop diseases and treatment for those diseases. Certainly also to look at, can we use digital technology, electronic medical records? Can we think of a smaller sample size if we have strong animal model data that can help us get the drug approved faster, and then have maybe post-marketing commitments to look at long-term outcomes? Because you have to think from a patient's perspective, they're waiting for help and for hope. And so ways I think that the regulators and industry and the scientific community kind of working together to think of study designs that are as few as patients as possible getting placebo, I think is critical as well, to make sure that we get patients at a time in their life when the disease is most active. Because often you treat with older adults and then you go down to younger children, but many of these diseases are genetic and afflicted by children. And if you don't intervene early, then that, your patient loses that opportunity to have a healthier life. So I think there needs to definitely be more work on this. And what I'm saying about rare, it's even, I think, worse for ultra rare, because the fewer the patients, the higher the risk really of doing studies, for sure. And then also the concern is, from a commercial perspective, it's very hard to justify doing that work in ultra rare diseases, which is opposite of what all of us want, because we are in rare disease to really make a difference and bring medicines to patients. So definitely, I think the future has to change in how we address this, both from a development perspective, a regulatory perspective, and then from a reimbursement perspective.
So that's exactly what I was going to ask about next, because I think you run up against this in rare disease all the time. This notion of sort of how do you make the economics work for the pharma company, which is a little distasteful to talk about, but at the same time, you have to sell a certain number of a drug to make back the costs to develop it. And on top of that, I think when we talk about disease modifying therapies and when we talk about cell and gene therapies, there's already a concern, even in more less rare diseases, about how do you make your money back if you only sell it one time, which is kind of the dream, right, for these disease modifying therapies. So I can see those factors sort of compounding on each other, going to the payers and saying, like,
Mhm.
how do we make this work? How do we, because everyone wants to get these patients the cures
Yeah.
and nobody
Yeah.
wants to go broke doing it.
Yeah.
Right.
No, absolutely. No, I don't think I can answer the question completely. I think obviously what we are trying to do is provide valuable treatment options for patients, because I always think health is wealth. So if you make a population healthier, even though it's in rare, ultra rare diseases, then the family unit, the community obviously is as well as well. I think the point being is really correct. There has to be a change in mindset with the reimbursement, the payers, health technology assessors, kind of working together with the pharma group and the regulators to come up with a, a set of endpoints or comparators that are really acceptable across all those three different groups, because often it's not harmonized and that becomes problematic. So I think that's one. I think two, also there needs to be, and I am a physician, I'm not, a market access person specifically, but there has to be innovative ways of being able to reimburse companies for development, because it is an extensive, both financial and people resource intense work that needs to be done for rare disease trials, considering, mentioned the risks of the geographic distribution of patients all over the world, their disabilities. Sometimes it's very hard for them to get to study sites, so you have to make special arrangements for them. So I think all these things have to be put into perspective. And I think it's not one group that can solve all these problems, but I think it's going to be really the voice of the patient and the patient organizations across the groups like Eurotas or NORD to really come as a force, saying that this has to change to make sure that our patients aren't caught in some of these issues, which is, of course, none of us want that. We want to bring medicines to patients. But certainly, to your point, when you're looking at business development opportunities, you have to balance the epidemiology, the regulatory development pathway, what's available currently for patients, and you think of not just the regulatory development pathway, but also from the value proposition perspective to payers. That has to be decided, early on as well, to make sure that you're financially viable with your program while you're adding value and getting, these medicines out to patients.
We're in such a kind of time of change when it comes to pharma R&D. Not only are there completely new kinds of treatments and we're understanding diseases better than we have before, but there's also, you mentioned earlier, kind of the notion that when you've got 1,000 patients worldwide, putting half of them in a placebo group doesn't feel great, especially with a progressive disease where it makes a huge difference whether they're treated now or later. um and I've heard a lot of talk about that, about this idea that, like, do we need to rethink the placebo? Like, yes, it makes for good science, but these patients who get left behind because they're in that group, when there's a therapy that could save their life, doesn't feel fair, doesn't feel good.
Yeah.
uh, and there are alternatives now, right? You mentioned the natural history study. There's computer models and virtual control groups and things like that. So I'm curious, at Ipsen, how are you
Mhm.
guys thinking about the placebo in general and sort of like its future
Yeah.
and these new kind of novel trial designs?
Yes. No, I mean, it's actually challenging, but actually exciting, because you can think innovatively. There is I'm talking not about FOP, but for another program called primary biliary cholangitis. There's a PBC study group coming up this weekend. And one of the panel discussions on adult liver diseases is on the placebo, to have a placebo or not. And it's clearly a question to all of us, where I understand from a regulatory perspective, when you're trying to understand the activity of your drug and the target product profile with respect to safety, you do want a placebo group to know what is drug effect and what's not. So that is important. So I don't think it ever will go away, but I think it has to be put in perspective. If we do know about the drug from preclinical toxicology, you can kind of predict where you might have some adverse events, and maybe It's a question of we have as short as possible a placebo period, or a randomization 2 or 3 to 1 where there's more active versus placebo, and it's a short period of time that patients can go on to the open label extension. And then maybe it's also using digital technology, right? Electronic health records, because you can literally have, with metadata, you can get information on the disease and the safety profile, and looking long term at the patients that can sort of help you decide whether over time your safety profile stays consistent or not. So I don't think it's going away, but I think you have to put it in perspective, because you can't do placebo in certain types of treatments, like gene therapy. You're not going to give a placebo. So I think we just need to think also a bit from maybe an oncology mindset on how they're not using placebo clearly for patients, because it's life threatening, and these diseases are often life threatening for our rare disease patients. But also thinking about ways that we can, through study design or master protocols or adaptive study designs, look at multiple different ways to treat different regimens, and to minimize that placebo part for just a part of it to compare, and then have those patients then randomized back to a different, to an active drug, and maybe different doses of that active drug. So I think there's no answer to this, but I think the regulators have to be open-minded, and they have in the past relating to, well, there are guidance documents for the FDA on using a natural history comparator, and they're very clear on what their guidance is. But with that being said, until you actually have a natural history comparator, often they're the same patients and they have aged out, so the disease may be slightly different. So it's often a very difficult way to continue to ensure that the agency knows that your natural history is truly representative of the patients who you treated during that period of time. So it's not without challenges, and I would say it's actually it's risky for companies to not have that placebo group.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Sort of try to have as many tools in our toolbox as we can, and then use the right ones.
Correct. Correct.
Are there anything, as you look over the last few years in particular in rare disease and ultra rare, are there encouraging signs? Are there things that you think have gotten better? Are there reasons for the patients who have these diseases to
Mhm.
be optimistic about the way that trends in R&D are going these days?
I always am hopeful, and I do believe what I've been excited of seeing over the last 15 years is just the strength and the voice of the patient advisory groups, who are working directly with clinicians, pharmaceutical, and regulators, and really finding their voice for a specific disease area, but also within a larger area, like bone dysplasias, for example, not just FOP association, but realizing that they need to be heard and they should be heard. And that's not just from the regulators, but also heard early on interacting with companies doing clinical trials, where we'll set up patient advisory boards to review a protocol, review the endpoints, making sure that from a patient perspective and a family perspective, the procedures and the protocol are feasible. And so I think in the past it was just more patriarchal, where this is your protocol and patients are expected to comply and do the procedures. But now we're actually taking this to the patients really early on and hearing their voice and whether this will work or not and whether it's meaningful to them. And I think what's really interesting, the regulators are more and more asking for that direct patient feedback during clinical trials. So I think exit interviews from a clinical trial are being asked for by regulators, where you are getting information from the patient, how they actually felt in the clinical study. And that direct patient feedback is something that the regulators want to listen to. So that to me is very encouraging, making that difference versus just looking at the data. We're actually thinking about, this is what a patient is feeling and experiencing, and this is how they felt during the study. I think that's really, really critical. And I think also having the patients be more involved in regulatory meetings. So for the FDA, for advisory committees, they have open sessions where they give you patient testimonials, and physicians who are taking care of these patients can have a voice. And I think that's really critical for these ultra rare diseases. And also, I think for the EMA, they're also looking at getting that patient access to the regulators to explain what their daily life is. I think is really critical. So I'm excited about that specifically. And I'm also excited just from a scientific perspective, just the different modalities of treatment and how we are learning more and more about the diseases, that we can find the actual cause or the defect of the disease much earlier and really kind of create a silver magic bullet to pinpoint that one mutation. So that's really exciting in the future, looking at perhaps we can look at similarities between different types of diseases and think of maybe doing basket trials or master protocols where we're looking at one drug that may affect multiple diseases if they have similar pathways. So that's all really exciting. Understanding like the clinical trial development and just innovation in that, I think is really very interesting to us who really like the challenge really of rare diseases. So it's an exciting time to be in rare diseases for sure.
Any other final thoughts, Jennifer, before we wrap up here?
Yeah, no, I think the message I heard very clearly from talking to patients and also regulators is that it's going to be a partnership between the patients, pharma and industry who really want to make a difference, and then the patient organizations. I think having that public-private partnership working together with certainly the patient in the center of this is going to be really critical. So I'm really excited and proud of the work that Ipsen's doing in working in rare and ultra rare diseases, and just really the commitment to continuing to build our portfolio in bone diseases and now liver diseases. And so certainly, if many of us say if we're not actually seeing patients and taking care of them, this is a really wonderful, fulfilling way to know that you're giving hope to patients and their families. So I recommend clinicians and medical students to really think about going into rare disease research. It's certainly really fulfilling, and you certainly feel you're having a direct impact on a patient and family's life. So thank you actually for taking the time, Jonah, for viewing this as an important topic.
No, thank you so much for speaking with us. I really appreciated learning about this from your perspective, and appreciate the work that Ipsen's doing. So good luck.
Okay, thank you so much. All right, bye bye.